Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
We're digging into a stack of sources today, and they tackle a really big, often contentious question. Is religion actually a force for peace in the world?
It's a huge question. And this material, it looks at it from different angles: history, current events, even prophecy.
Right. So our goal, as always, is to unpack this material together, pull out the most important nuggets, the key insights.
Help you get a clear picture of what these specific sources are saying about religion's role.
Exactly. Okay, let's get into it.
Absolutely. And, right off the bat, the picture painted by these sources,
Yeah.
it's complex, sometimes, honestly, a bit unsettling when it comes to religion and conflict.
It really is. One detail that really grabbed me was the anecdote about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre
Yeah.
in Jerusalem.
Oh,
You'd think, okay, one of Christianity's holiest sites. It should be about unity, right? But the material suggests it's actually been a stage for, well, surprising hostility between different denominations.
it's quite a striking example they use. I mean, despite how sacred it is, these sources highlight it's frequently been the scene of, well, violent clashes.
Violent clashes between monks.
Yes, reportedly monks and priests from 6 different Christian groups have actually come to blows over things like usage rights.
Wow.
To the point where, according to the sources, riot police, armed with assault rifles, have had to step in just to take temporary control.
Like that image. It's pretty jarring. And the sources are clear this isn't just some, isolated weird event.
No, not at all. They present it more as indicative of a much broader pattern globally. This stack points to a long, long history of bloodshed tied directly to religious feeling.
And it lists examples.
Oh, yeah. Specific conflicts across the globe. Indonesia, Northern Ireland, the Middle East, Kashmir, India, Nigeria, the Balkans, Sri Lanka.
So all over the place.
And involving all the major players: Christians, Buddhists, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs. The key point highlighted is how, in these cases, individuals, quote, have relied on religion to provide political identities and give license to vengeful ideologies.
License to vengeful ideologies. That's strong. But then the material throws in a counterpoint, doesn't it?
It does. It brings up that study from Bradford University's Department of Peace Studies.
And their conclusion was quite different, as I recall.
Very different. They concluded that surprisingly few wars in the last 100 years or so were, quote, genuinely religious. Their take was that many conflicts just labeled as religious wars by, say, the media were actually more about nationalism or liberation or self-defense.
Okay, so a conflict might get painted as religious, but the root causes are maybe somewhere else.
That's the suggestion from that study. But what's really fascinating here is the tension, the tension between these different viewpoints within our source material.
Right, you've got the history saying religion is linked to conflict.
And then this study saying, well, maybe it's not the main driver that often. And then other parts of our material push back hard on that study.
Pushing back how?
Arguing that, no, religion is deeply connected to violence, pretty much everywhere. And they state that clergy haven't just, looked the other way. They've often actively condoned and supported conflicts.
Can you give some examples from the sources on that?
Sure. They mention right-wing Christians in the U.S., angry Muslims and Jews in the Middle East, quarreling Hindus and Muslims in South Asia, even conflicts involving indigenous communities in parts of Africa and Indonesia.
So a wide range again.
And there's even a specific historical example cited from the New York Times back in 1917. It noted how clergymen were preaching war sermons from the pulpit, and churches were literally acting as recruiting stations.
Wow. So whether it's the sole cause or just deeply tangled up in it, the sources seem pretty clear. Religion's relationship with conflict throughout history is messy and often troubling.
That definitely seems to be the main takeaway from this part of the material, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shift gears slightly. Beyond just asking if religion causes war, the sources bring up other problems they see associated with religion. They sort of say, look, even if getting rid of religion wouldn't magically end all war, one thing seems undeniable.
Religion hasn't united humanity.
Exactly. It just hasn't.
And they dive into why they think this disunity is so persistent. First, they point fingers at the major religious powers themselves. Always in rivalry, right?
Perpetual rivalry.
Can these global faiths truly coexist peacefully when their basic beliefs or historical claims often clash? That's a core question the material seems to raise.
That alone creates friction on a global scale.
Absolutely. And then it's not just rivalry between the big religions. Even within them, there's this incredible fragmentation.
Like within Christianity.
Oh, yeah. The sources cite one estimate over 30,000 different denominations just within Christendom.
30,000, that's a lot.
It's staggering. And it's not just Christianity. We see a Muslim scholar quoted acknowledging that disunity among Muslims is a huge problem in the Islamic world.
And Buddhism, Hinduism.
Same story, according to this material. Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, all described here as fractured into numerous, often conflicting sects.
So you've got rivalry between the big players and then constant division inside them. That paints a picture of disunity.
It certainly does.
The sources also flag another issue they see as damaging. Religion getting mixed up, tangled up in politics.
Yes, there's a quote from The Economist observing that religious people are just becoming more vocal, more active across many fields, including secular ones like politics.
And the material suggests that's a dangerous mix when religion and state power get too close.
Particularly dangerous, yes. It sounds almost like mixing combustible ingredients, as you said.
Yeah.
The sources bring in historians who note, and I'm quoting loosely here, that religion is more likely to be a cause of war when religion and the state authorities become closely allied or intertwined.
An explosive cocktail, I think, was the phrase used.
That's the one, where nationalistic hatred, racial prejudice, ethnic rivalry, religious hostility, it all gets blended together. The lines become, quote, virtually indistinguishable.
It makes things incredibly volatile.
It does, and looking at that whole picture, the conflict, the division, the political entanglement, it really prompts an important question the sources raise. Does this messy reality actually line up with the claims many religions make about a loving creator?
That's a tough question. It definitely makes you pause and think about that potential disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
So given this pretty critical analysis of division and conflict tied to religion, the sources then pivot a bit, don't they? They introduce a different idea.
They do. They float the possibility that maybe the issue isn't religion in general, like all religion is bad, but maybe it's a specific kind of religion that's the problem. Or perhaps a departure from an original, maybe truer form.
And that's where they bring in early Christianity.
Exactly. They start describing early Christianity, the form established by Jesus and his apostles. And they portray it as standing in really stark contrast to a lot of what developed later and what we often see today.
So what was so different about it, according to these sources?
Well, they highlight several key things. First, political neutrality. Big one.
Neutrality, meaning?
Meaning they stayed out of politics. The material mentions Jesus specifically refusing political power, citing passages like Matthew 4 and John 6.
Okay, so politically neutral, what else?
Nonviolence. Another crucial point. Jesus is shown rebuking disciples who reached for swords, who wanted to use force. They reference passages in Matthew, Luke, and John about that.
And a strong emphasis on love. I remember that part.
Absolutely critical, yes.
Yeah.
The sources stress that the core teachings were about love. Not just, loving people who were like you, but love for strangers, people from different ethnic backgrounds, different races. They point to Acts 10 and James 3 for that.
So this specific form of worship, the sources argue, was actually a force for peace.
That's their argument, yes.
Yeah.
That this original model was peaceful and unifying.
But clearly, based on the earlier discussions, something changed dramatically.
Yes. The sources describe a major shift. They say that original Christianity became contaminated. That's the word used. Contaminated by outside influences, things like Greek philosophy, human traditions, and importantly, nationalism, which are all presented as forces that divide people.
And they tie this transformation quite specifically to one historical figure, right?
Emperor Constantine, yes. Yeah. He's presented as pivotal. The sources quote a historical review that says something like, Constantine's conversion led to the militarization of the Christian movement.
Militarization?
Yeah. No longer guided primarily by Christ's compassionate teachings, but more spearheaded by the emperor's political and geographical goals. Conquest.
So religion being used to justify imperial aims.
Essentially, yes. The quote continues that Christians, including the emperor himself, felt compelled to find religious justifications for war, things that weren't necessarily there in the original teachings.
Then the conclusion drawn.
The conclusion drawn in this material is pretty blunt. Under Constantine, a counterfeit version of Christianity was born.
Wow. Counterfeit. That's a strong historical claim. It presents a really clear break, an original peaceful version, and then a later corrupted one.
It's a very distinct narrative they present.
And the sources don't just leave this as something that happened centuries ago. They connect it to the present day.
No, they don't. They specifically point to one contemporary religious group that they say is actively trying to emulate that original Christian pattern today.
And they identify that group as Jehovah's Witnesses.
That's right. As described in this stack of material, they're presented as quite distinct from mainstream Christendom.
How so?
Well, their beliefs are said to be based entirely on the Bible, which, quote, entirely supplants tradition. And crucially, like the early Christians described, they are presented as politically neutral.
Politically neutral, so not taking sides in conflicts.
Exactly. There's a quote included from a professor at Warsaw University identifying Jehovah's Witnesses as, quote, the largest community in the world today that objects to wars.
The sources also mention they aren't anti-state, though, that they're generally law-abiding.
Correct. Law-abiding, advocating for peace, but strictly not participating in warfare. That's the picture painted.
And globally united, that ties back to the earlier point about division.
Yes, they're presented that way, globally united in their faith, supposedly overcoming the social, ethnic, racial, or class divisions that plague so many other groups.
And the sources mention there have been consequences for this stance.
They do. They underscore the seriousness of this neutrality by stating that thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses have actually been imprisoned over the years because of it.
So the material concludes that this specific group has, in their view,
Successfully reinstated the form of worship that was established by Christ and his apostles. That's the claim made.
we even see a few unique structural points highlighted about them. Things like
Right. No formal clergy class, elders and teachers and missionaries are unsalaried, no tithes or collections during meetings.
relying purely on anonymous donations.
Those details are included, presumably, to further illustrate how this group is presented as different and perhaps aligned with what the sources describe as that early Christian model.
Okay. Now, those are pretty significant claims, both about religious history and about this specific contemporary group. It's a whole narrative. How do the sources try to establish a basis for trusting this particular viewpoint? Why should someone believe this interpretation of religion and its future?
Good question. Their foundation, the bedrock of their argument, is presented as the reliability of the Bible itself.
Okay, so they build the case for their perspective by first building a case for the Bible's trustworthiness. How do they go about that?
They lean heavily on history and prophecy. A major example they use is ancient Babylon,
Babylon. Okay.
described, as this magnificent city of wonders, the capital of the third great world power in Bible history. And the sources offer several points, they argue, are confirmations, archaeological, historical confirmations of biblical accounts related to Babylon.
Like the story of Belshazzar, maybe. I remember reading something about him.
Exactly. The book of Daniel names Belshazzar as king when Babylon fell. For a long time, secular historians didn't list him as the final king. They listed Nabonidus. It seemed less a contradiction.
Right.
But the sources mention archaeologists finding these clay cylinders, the Nabonidus Chronicle and others, with cuneiform writing, including a prayer from Nabonidus for his eldest son, Belsar-Usur, or Belshazzar. And later findings confirm Belshazzar was co-regent with his father Nabonidus for many years, essentially acting as king. So the sources present this as archaeological evidence aligning with the Bible's account, resolving the apparent discrepancy.
Okay, that's one example. What about other things like Babylonian practices?
Well, the Bible mentions the king of Babylon using divination, specifically looking at livers for omens. That's in Ezekiel 21.
Right.
The sources note that Babylonian society was absolutely steeped in divination and astrology. And they cite archaeological finds. One book mentions 32 clay liver models, inscribed with omens, found at just one ancient site in Mesopotamia.
So a specific practice mentioned in the Bible is confirmed by archaeology.
That's how it's presented, yes,
Yeah.
as evidence that the Bible accurately reflects the culture and practices of the time.
And there was that quote from an archaeologist, Nelson Glukic.
Yes, that's a well-known one they include. He's quoted saying something to the effect that he excavated for decades with a Bible in one hand and a trowel in the other, and that he never found the Bible to be in error regarding historical perspective.
So the sources build a case for the Bible's historical accuracy. What about the prophecy angle?
That's arguably presented as even stronger evidence. The stack highlights the prophecies about Babylon's destruction, specifically citing Isaiah 13, written about 2 centuries before Babylon fell. It foretells the city's complete overthrow, saying it would become like Sodom and Gomorrah, and importantly, quote, she will never be inhabited.
Which historically is what happened, right? It eventually became ruins.
It did. It was conquered in 539 BCE by the Medes and Persians. But the sources point to an even more astonishing detail within the prophecies.
Which is?
The conqueror himself, King Cyrus, was apparently foretold by name almost 200 years before he was even born.
By name.
That's the claim, citing Isaiah 45.1-3 and also Jeremiah 50, predicting the conqueror's name centuries in advance.
That is remarkable, if accurate. How is that presented as confirmed?
Well, the sources point to secular historians like the ancient Greek writers Herodotus and Xenophon. They are cited as confirming the specific manner of Cyrus's conquest.
How he took the city.
Exactly. How he diverted the Euphrates River, which ran through Babylon, lowering the water level so his troops could wade into the city. And crucially, how they got in through river gates that had been carelessly left open just as Bible prophecy, like in Jeremiah 51, had indicated would happen.
Wow. So the details matched the predictions.
That's the argument made. This level of specific, accurate prediction, especially naming someone centuries ahead, is presented as powerful evidence. Evidence that the Bible's author identified in the sources as Jehovah God truly has the ability to foretell the future. They cite Isaiah 46 for that principle.
Okay.
And this predictive power, demonstrated with Babylon, is presented as the strong basis for trusting the Bible's claims, not just about ancient history, but about our future as well.
Okay, that definitely lays out a foundation for why someone might trust this perspective. But let's talk about faith itself. There's this common idea, isn't there, that faith and reason are just opposites. You either have faith or you use reason. How do these sources handle that? Because here's where it gets really interesting.
It does get interesting because the sources directly challenge that whole notion. They argue very strongly that the kind of faith described in the Bible is not a negation of reason. It's not blind. It's not irrational. It's not just credulity. Believing something for no good reason.
So it's not just about shutting your brain off and believing.
Quite the opposite, according to this material. They quote Romans 12.1, and one translation, the Jerusalem Bible, renders it as offering God a sacred service with your power of reason.
Power of reason.
Yes. Other versions say spiritual worship or reasonable service. The emphasis here is that Bible faith, as presented in these sources, actually requires careful thought. It's meant to be firmly based on reason.
Okay, but if it's based on reason, you need something solid to reason with, right? You need information.
Precisely. And the sources stress that accurate information is absolutely fundamental, foundational. They quote Romans 10.17, faith follows the thing heard. And they mention the importance of gaining accurate knowledge of truth, citing passages like 1 Timothy 2.4 and John 8.32.
So it matters what you hear, what information you base your faith on. It needs to be accurate.
And crucially, it needs to be tested, verified. The sources urge the reader or listener to make sure of all things, that's 1 Thessalonians 5.21, to test the inspired expressions, 1 John 4.1, and to prove to yourself the will of God, Romans 12.2. It's not passive acceptance.
They use that example from the book of Acts, the people in Beroea.
Yes, the Beroeans, Acts 17.11. They're praised not just because they eagerly received the message, but because they were, quote, carefully examining the scriptures daily as to whether these things were so.
Carefully examining daily, so they were checking it out for themselves.
Exactly. They weren't just passive listeners. They were active investigators. They were verifying the information.
And the Bible's own definition of faith, the one in Hebrews, does that fit this idea of reason and evidence?
It really does. Hebrews 11.1 is quoted, defining faith as the assured expectation of things hoped for, the evident demonstration of realities, though not beheld.
Assured expectation, evident demonstration. That doesn't sound like blind hope.
No. The sources interpret assured expectation as confidence based on solid promises or evidence, and evident demonstration as convincing proof, even for things you can't physically see right now, like God or his future promises. So real faith, in this view, is built on carefully scrutinizing the available data, the evidence, which then leads to conviction.
Which really makes you think, doesn't it? It raises that question. Are you, the listener, examining the basis for your own beliefs, whatever they might be?
It's a profound question to consider.
Definitely something to ponder. Okay, let's loop back now to our main theme of peace versus conflict. Because the sources connect all this, the Bible's reliability, this reasoned view of faith, directly to a specific prophetic outlook for the future.
Yes, they do. They focus quite a bit on that prophecy in Daniel chapter 2. The one about the immense image made of different metals.
Right, the giant statue. What does that image represent in the interpretation presented here?
It's laid out as representing a sequence of dominant world powers throughout history, starting with Babylon as the head of gold. then moving down through Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and eventually reaching the feet and toes, which represent the final phase.
And who do they identify that final phase with?
The source is connected to the Anglo-American world power, which they identify as the seventh major power mentioned in Bible history.
And there's something specific about the feet of this image, isn't there? The materials they're made of.
Yes, that's crucial. The feet are a mixture of iron and clay.
Iron and clay. What does that symbolize?
It's interpreted as representing the politically divided, fragmented state of the world we see today during the time of this final world power. The iron represents lingering authoritarian strength, perhaps, but the clay represents the fragile, common elements, the populace, maybe conflicting ideologies. And Daniel 2.43 explicitly says about this mixture, they will not prove to be sticking together.
Will not prove to be sticking together. That certainly sounds like our unstable, fractured geopolitical world, doesn't it?
It seems to resonate strongly with the current state of affairs, yes. That inherent instability and division.
Okay, so the image represents this succession of powers, ending in a divided state. Then, something dramatic happens to this image in the prophecy.
Yes, a stone, described as being cut out not by human hands, but out of a large mountain, strikes the image.
Strikes it where?
Right on its feet of iron and clay, the foundation. And the impact is catastrophic. It crushes the entire image, grinding it all to powder.
Wow. So what does that stone symbolize?
Daniel himself explains it in the prophecy. The stone represents God's kingdom.
God's kingdom.
Yes, which the sources identify as the heavenly government ruled by Jesus Christ. Daniel 2.44 is quoted, saying that in the time of these final earthly kingdoms, God himself will set up a kingdom that will never be brought to ruin. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, and it itself will stand to times indefinite.
So this kingdom replaces all human governments.
That's the prophetic picture. And the result, according to the sources, citing passages like 1 Corinthians 15.25, is the establishment of lasting, universal peace and harmony. The ultimate solution to the conflict and division symbolized by the image and its fragile feet.
Okay, so that's the political dimension, but how does this connect back to the religious theme we started with, the problems within religion?
They link it through another key symbol from Bible prophecy, Babylon the Great, mentioned in the book of Revelation, chapter 17.
Babylon the Great. Who or what is that, according to this interpretation?
It's interpreted not as a literal city, but as a symbolic representation of the world empire of false religion. Specifically, forms of religion that are seen as having inherited or adopted core beliefs and practices from ancient Babylon.
Such as?
Things like belief in trinities, the immortality of the human soul, or a fiery netherworld or hell. Beliefs, the sources argue, originated in ancient Babylon and then spread, particularly finding a strong foothold within much of Christendom.
So, Babylon the Great represents false, divisive religion stemming from ancient roots. And what future does the source material foresee for this symbolic entity?
A definitive end. The sources conclude, based on prophecies like those in Revelation, that God will certainly render judgment among the nations and bring about the complete demise of religion that dishonors God.
The end of false religion.
Yes, this judgment is presented as part of establishing God's kingdom and is linked to the principle Jesus stated, quoted from Matthew 12.25, that any kingdom divided against itself will not stand. Since false religion is inherently divided and often allied with divided political systems, it's destined to fall.
So the prophecy points to an end for divided human governments and for divisive false religion, all replaced by God's unified kingdom bringing peace.
That's the ultimate vision presented in these sources, yes.
Yeah.
And they connect it back to that famous prophecy in Isaiah chapter 2 about people beating their swords into plowshares and nations not learning war anymore.
Right.
They present that prophecy as something that is already undergoing fulfillment right now among those they identify as practicing true religion, arguing that this form of worship is already a force for peace among its adherents, demonstrating the kingdom's principles in action even before its full establishment.
It's a comprehensive vision, tying history, current conditions, and prophecy together. Now, beyond these huge themes of religion, conflict, and the future, this snack of sources also had a few other quite different, interesting deep dives tucked away. Maybe we can touch on one or two quickly.
Sure. Yeah, there were some fascinating side discussions. For instance, there was that section discussing the design of the human eye, specifically the retina.
Oh, right, the inverted retina, where the light has to pass through the nerve layers before hitting the photoreceptors. Some evolutionary arguments apparently frame that as sort of poor design, right?
Exactly. That's one perspective mentioned. But then Other sources in the stack presented a strong counterargument from a design perspective.
Arguing it's actually good design. How
They argued that this inverted arrangement is actually highly optimized, specifically for getting a rapid, rich supply of oxygen and nutrients to the photoreceptors, which are incredibly metabolically active. They sit right next to the choroid, a dense layer of blood vessels facilitated by the retinal pigment epithelium.
so it's about efficient plumbing and waste removal, essentially.
That's a big part of the argument, yes. And also that it saves crucial space within the eye compared to other possible arrangements. They referenced biologists and researchers like Miller, Bergman, Calkins, and Kroger who've discussed these functional advantages.
So what does this little detour mean in the context of our discussion?
Well, I think it means that how you interpret evidence often depends heavily on your starting assumptions design or undirected evolution. What looks like a flaw from one angle might look like an elegant solution from another, especially when you consider the complex physiological needs, different ways to see the same data.
Interesting. Okay, one more quick one. There was also that bit on sleep. Very practical.
Ah, yes, the importance of sleep. Definitely practical. The sources really hammered home that most adults need around 7 to 7.5 hours consistently.
Not just catching up on weekends.
Apparently not effectively, no.
Yeah.
They emphasize the cumulative effects of even minor sleep loss on brain function, attention, memory, decision-making. They talked about REM cycles, the dangers of those microsleeps, especially if you're driving.
That's a scary thought. And it affects physical health too, right? Not just the brain.
Absolutely. The material mentioned impaired immune function, specifically linking sleep loss to reduced effectiveness of T cells, which fight infection. And even impact on appetite, how sleep deprivation messes with hormones like leptin that regulate hunger.
Huh. I didn't realize it was that connected.
Yeah, and they included that interesting quote from Ecclesiastes 5.12 that way. Sweet is the sleep of the one serving, irrespective of whether it is little or much that he eats, but the plenty belonging to the rich one is not permitting him to sleep. Sort of implying that sometimes worries prevent the wealthy from sleeping well, while simple labor brings good rest.
So what's the takeaway from this sleep section?
Simply that sleep isn't some optional luxury we can skimp on without consequence. It's absolutely vital, maybe more than many of us realize, for our mental sharpness, our physical health, our overall well-being. Foundational stuff.
Foundational indeed. Wow. We have really covered a huge amount of ground in this deep dive, pulled apart a lot of threads.
We certainly have. We've looked closely at this collection of sources, exploring the perspectives they offer on religion's really complex, often difficult role in conflict throughout history.
And the argument presented that this is often tied to internal division within religions and their entanglement with politics.
Right. And then the contrast they draw with what they describe as an original, peaceful form of Christianity focused on neutrality and love.
We also looked at how they point to a specific contemporary group, Jehovah's Witnesses, as attempting to follow that early pattern today.
And we examine the basis the sources provide for trusting this whole narrative, focusing on claims about the Bible's historical reliability and especially its predictive prophecy, like with Babylon and Cyrus.
Plus, that interesting discussion about faith not being blind credulity, but something based on reason and evidence requiring investigation.
And we even dipped into those side notes on interpreting biological design and the absolute necessity of getting enough sleep.
It all ties back to that idea of being well-informed, doesn't it? It's not just about collecting facts, but seeing how these different pieces of information, history, prophecy, science, current events, might fit together, what picture they might paint.
Exactly. This deep dive has definitely highlighted some very different, challenging views on a profound subject, religion, peace, conflict, and presented a very specific outlook on the future, all drawn from the source material we had in front of us.
So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final thought to consider, something to maybe mull over on your own, building on everything we've unpacked today.
It's this. If, as these sources strongly suggest, achieving true, lasting, universal peace actually requires a fundamental shift not just in politics, but maybe even in human nature itself, along with the change in global governance.
What would it take for you personally to genuinely believe that such a profound transformation is actually possible? What kind of evidence or reasoning would convince you? Something to think about.